I'm Stephanie. I work in the DC office. I'm our National Outreach Coordinator. That's my old title. And I do most of our outreach to other environmental groups mostly, but also some businesses and national organizations that have headquarters in DC and usually pretty big membership. And I'm going to let Carla and Jim introduce themselves.
I'm Carla Wise, and I am a chapter co-leader in Corvallis, Oregon. I'm a liaison to a Democratic member of Congress, and I started the Progressive Outreach Action Team about a year ago to work on messaging that works with Democrats and with progressives. This is my first time doing any presenting in front of a CCL conference of this size, so... But I know you're a very friendly crowd, so.
Good morning, and I'm Jim Tolbert, and I am the liaison for Congressman Meadows, who's a Republican in the House, currently head of the House Freedom Caucus. And I moved to North Carolina 2.5 years ago from Michigan, where I was the liaison for Congressman Amash, who's the head of the House Liberty Caucus, strong libertarian. And I'm a Republican, and I enjoy getting along with both of them and enjoy the conversations I have with them and their staff. And part of the beauty of CCL is the panel that you see here is the panel that you see in our audience. That we are a bipartisan organization. It's a lot of what drew me to CCL when I quit my job 4.5 years ago and said I want to have a voice in the climate dialogue we're having in our country, and looked around at organizations and said, this is the organization I need to be in. So I want to just start with, we've kind of introduced ourselves, and I just want a quick show in the audience of if you had to identify yourself as left of center or right of center or other, if you can't make up your mind. If you'd stand up, if you'd consider yourself somewhere left of the center, just stand up for a minute and look around. And this is the group that identifies themselves as somewhere left of the center. Thank you. And if you identify yourself as somewhere right of the center, stand up and look around. So in all fairness, we should applaud for both groups because we're all needed in this organization. And if you'd identify yourself as other, if you'd stand up and say, you know, I just don't quite fit. Yeah, a lot of people don't want to measure themselves on that metric. So as we look at this, a lot of times in CCL, we have this identity that says, hey, maybe we don't represent the population as a whole in the United States because we have a lot more people to the left of the center than we do to the right of center, which is a fact. When we poll ourselves as an organization, that's what we find. And I just want to change that perspective or change the way you frame it in your own mind. Next slide. So Anthony Lacerowitz, this is about his Six Americas work that I'm kind of assuming most of you are somewhat familiar with, where he divides out the United States into 6 categories: alarmed, concerned, on the people more likely to do something about climate change, to curious, to disengaged, not really engaged at all, to doubtful, to dismissive on the far side. And in 2016, when he did his polling, he asked people, so who do you plan to vote for if the people on the ballot were Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump? And in CCL, we are an organization of people that are alarmed about climate change. That's who's going to pay their way to DC. That's who's going to be writing letters to members of Congress. That's who's going to go out and give talks. And if you look at Anthony Lacerowitz's work, when he polled those people, 64% of the alarmed people said they thought they'd vote for Hillary Clinton, and 11% said they thought they'd vote for Donald Trump. And that's not far off from the metrics that we see inside CCL. And furthermore, there's groups of other people that said, I just don't know, or I'm not registered, or I haven't decided yet. So when we look at the room around us, or when we look at CCL, we're not that far off from Americans that are concerned about climate change. That said, I don't want to frame it that way to have us not focus on saying, you know what, there are a lot of Republican members of Congress, and we want some Republicans on our side and some conservatives on our side speaking out to them. And so that's a lot of the focus of my comments this morning is going to be about how to speak out to those members of Congress. So we're going to have a discussion in here around speaking to conservatives. And some of this I hope will be a repeat for you, because some of this material is going to be framed from some of Jonathan Haidt's work and some other work that I hope you've bumped into before through CCL or on your own. But I really want to focus it on saying each of you are going to be walking into some meetings with members of Congress tomorrow. And I would assume most of you have at least one Republican on your agenda. And as you walk into those meetings, can this talk help prepare you as you walk into a meeting with some Republican staffers or with a Republican member of Congress? And so my portion here is going to be really focused around saying, how do we take some of these ideas that maybe you've heard before and talk about them in a way that can help you change how you communicate with a member of Congress tomorrow or his staff person, much less when you go home and speak to your neighbor. So what I want to do right now, before we move to right now, is for everybody to pair up in groups of two, and all I want you to do is a quick introduction so that everybody's paired up, a quick hello, and figure out who's going to speak first. The person with the most conservative-looking shirt or blouse is going to speak first. So pair up really quick and just do a quick introduction. All right, just that quick. Is there anybody that's not paired up? Is there anybody that's not paired up? All right. Quick introduction. Is there anybody that's not paired up? Raise your hand. So I'm assuming everybody, okay, there's a person that's not paired up, and there's a person. And there's an empty seat here. Are you set? All right. All right, let's bring the focus back in. That was just to share your name. The reason I had you pair up ahead of time. Shh. That has to be our thing going here. The strong shush. That is an effective thing because we have no silverware to chime things like we're at a wedding. So the reason I wanted you to pair up is because we're going to do a dialogue experiment here. Or experience here where you're going to be in a meeting. I want you to set your mind up like you're in a meeting with a member of Congress tomorrow, and the minute the video ends, the group that you're with looks to you and the first speaker, and you're up, and you have to say something. And so what I want you to do is just after this video, immediately go into your dialogue and have the first person say what they'd say. Don't discuss anything, have the second person say what they'd say, and then you can start talking about how did that feel or what did you say. The scenario, you're in with a Republican member of Congress from Louisiana, Representative Clay Higgins, and you were going to have a meeting with a staffer. Representative Higgins just walked in and said, hey, I do have 10 minutes in my schedule, and your constituents, so let's talk. The meeting lead just explained what CF&D is. We've all been through the laser talk. They laid it out really well, and ended with, so Congressman Higgins, we've explained our policy and why we're here, and we'd like to hear what you think about the subject. Needs volume. He thinks for a minute and then says,
question very carefully the science. Well, I certainly do not disagree with the fact that climate change happens, but I do think that it's reasonable to question very carefully the science that has used models which have sometimes come under fire for having been sort of fraudulently manipulated in order to produce a result. When we talk about spending the people's treasure and the very concept of that we can fix climate change with some sort of a tax is something that I certainly take very seriously with regards to having intelligent debate about. In other words, I will not follow blindly into any endeavor that that mandates the harvesting of the people's treasure. Climate change has existed well before human history. So the question is not whether or not our climate changes across the planet, nor is it really a question that the human race does have some sort of impact upon climate change. The question becomes to what degree and at what extent and what sort of time frame and how can we really best address that, and does it call for harvesting of the people's treasure?
A pause in the conversation, the rest of your group looks to you and you say, so about halfway through if you haven't switched yet. Thirty seconds left. All right, how did that feel? If we can wrap up, we're going to keep moving in our conversation. So if you can wrap up here. Let's bring our attention back up. Great, thank you. And next slide. So next slide, Ricky. Thank you. All right, thank you. So my hat is off to Amy Bennett, who found that interview on extended interviews on PBS NewsHour's clips. That is real footage from a member of Congress that you were responding to. Sorry. So what I would like to do during the rest of my time up here is to help structure a way that you can look at listening to that clip and finding constructive things to say. I've had many conversations with people that start like that, and they can be very constructive conversations. One of my favorite clips to just frame how you want to approach it is Benjamin Franklin. Remember, not only to say the right thing in the right moment, but far more difficult is to leave unsaid the wrong thing at a tempting moment. So next slide. As we're listening to anyone, Congressman Higgins was nice enough to put on the table for the whole country what he thought about the subject matter. He put a lot on the table right there. And if you were in a dialogue with him, he was nice enough to put all that on the table for you. And as we listen to Congressman Higgins talk, oftentimes we view his position and we think about our position, the green circle, and we think about the differences. And what we hear are the differences. And what we hear are the points where we say, his position, my position, his position, my position, and we walk away from it thinking, okay, here's what I need to say to him. Are all these things in the green circle? You're going way ahead of me. And what I want to coach you on is that when you're listening to somebody speak, what you want to be listening for is the overlap as much as you're listening for the differences. So by all means, you need to be listening to say, here's a point I think I need to come around to in a discussion with this person. But you almost never want to start with that point of saying, this is your position and this is my position, and I need to talk to you about where we differ. And so what I really want to coach you into thinking is that you want to find that overlap and anchor yourself in that point where you agree with them. Anchor yourself in as many points as you can where you agree with a person, where you can find common ground between something that you believe in and something that they believe in that's honestly something that you believe in, not just a placating statement at the beginning of a sentence. That's not the next slide. Oftentimes when we listen to a member of Congress, we think that the positions are really far apart and that they look like that last circle. Myself, when I speak to conservatives, I view the conservative space on climate more like this, where I view an honest evaluation of climate and an honest evaluation of conservative principles are two circles that overlap heavily, and that the areas when there's not that overlap are often just misunderstandings between people. And there are a number of other groups that view the world that way. A number of the partnering NGOs that we work with regularly have this view also, that the conservative space does not differ from our messaging, and that it's part of the fundamental internal belief I have when I walk into a meeting with a conservative. I am not here to get you to that space, to say, you know what, you view the world like Clay Higgins does, and that in reality you overlap that much. So next slide, where I want to go back to, there I am in the middle of that space. One more click. Where I want to get to is this position where you can say, okay, you might listen to a Republican and say there's some differences, but you can listen for those points of commonality. So one more click, and I think we're going to, and next slide. And what I really want you to avoid is not to listen to them in this way, but even more important is not to convince them that this is the situation. If you're listening to them this way and you approach them this way, you will convince them that they have nothing in common with you. And that's a really negative message to start with when you're trying to build a relationship with somebody. So what I'm going to, next slide, what I'm going to do is walk through we have a clicker. All right, I'm going to walk through a few slides on how to avoid that situation where you convince them there's no overlap. And I'm going to work off of Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory that I think a number of you have been introduced to through discussions we've had in the past. And first, before I go into it, though, it's such a nebulous or abstract phrase, moral foundations theory. It sounds like something that some statistician or mathematician out of the Air Force would be studying. And so I just want to break down those three words. Morals are simply our beliefs concerning what is and isn't appropriate for us to do. Foundation, obviously, is just what's underlying something, and a theory is just an idea. So if you're listening about Jonathan Haidt's, the next part of the discussion, this is really just underlying ideas about how people figure out what is and what isn't acceptable for them to do. That's what we're talking about. Green button. There's like 3 green buttons here. I'll try that one. The big one. So Jonathan Haidt's, from a number of dimensions, came at this and said, you know what, I think there are some underlying values that people refer to as being relevant when they figure out what is and what is not acceptable for them to do. And came up with the top 5 dimensions and added the 6th that I'm not going to talk too much about. Harm versus care. You know what, it's not okay to just go hurt somebody. That's not okay. Most people agree with that. It's something we consider when we figure out what's acceptable for me to do. Is it fair? So it might not be okay to hurt, to lock somebody up in my basement or to steal $3,000 from them. But if somebody's caught drunk driving a 3rd time, I'm very willing to have the government take $3,000 from them, maybe even lock them up for a while. That's fair. So the fairness comes in there. Loyalty, in-group loyalty and betrayal is another dimension, another value that people consider relevant or less relevant when they're figuring out what is and isn't acceptable for them to do. And this has to do with standing with your group that you belong in. And I just want to give an example because sometimes this is a dimension that people have a little harder time saying, well, is that really relevant? That just gets us into trouble. We end up with a bunch of bad decisions. Right now, if you got a text and you looked at your text and said, hey, it's just a news alert. Somebody tackled their neighbor and broke 5 of their ribs and they're going to jail. That never happens. You wouldn't go out of the room and go, well, I wonder if that guy that got took into jail is okay and if he's getting representation. If it said, if it was your sister saying, that this was somebody from your hometown, did you see, somebody from your hometown just got sent to jail for tackling their neighbor, you'd probably go, yeah, okay, interesting, I'll deal with that later. If it was your sister saying, you know what, your brother just got put in jail for tackling his neighbor, you'd probably go, I'm out of here. You would not be in the room anymore, you'd be out on the phone calling and figuring out if your brother needs some help. Your brother is in a group that's closer to you, and your neighbor is even a little closer than just a stranger because you would have been curious. And we do value, all of us have groups that we value. We just consider it at different levels of relevance when we're making decisions. Authority versus subversion is another dimension, another value that people consider relevant or less relevant. When I was young, and it's something we all have known through our lives. When I was young and the canned peas were on the dinner menu and the plate came in front of me and my dad said, eat your peas, I ate my peas. I valued authority. I didn't like whine or cry every time. Maybe I did sometimes. We won't ask my parents that. But I ate my peas. If my dad now said, eat your peas, I'd go, yeah, no, I don't think so. But that brings back some fun memories. But we value authority differently at different times in our lives. And we all do value authority. And having authority figures that we like to listen to in our lives is something that we consider important to us. And finally, purity, sanctity versus degradation. The concept that some things can be abhorrent. There are some things that just cause disgust when we think about them, and I'm not going to go there because I really don't want to trigger disgust in all you. But there are also things that we consider sacred and pure, and that we like to hold those up. That's something that we consider when we're figuring out what is and is not acceptable behavior for us. So the reason we talk about these so often, if you've been in CCL long, is because Jonathan Haidt took this a step further and started testing people and saying, okay, how do you politically self-identify? And even asking them questions so that he could pick apart how he thought they self-identified without them saying, how do you self-identify? And what he found on this scale, so the x-axis here are people that view the averages of people that view themselves more conservative on your right, and averages of people that consider themselves more liberal on your left. And then this dimension up and down is how relevant these values are to them. So the higher you are in this chart, the more towards extremely relevant you are. And the lower you are, the more towards not relevant at all for me. And And what he found is that it breaks out, where people that are conservative typically, on average, have a different set of values that they turn to for figuring out what's appropriate for them to do. And the three that I want to focus in on for just a minute is the in-group loyalty, authority, and purity that people on the conservative end oftentimes think is more relevant for them to consider while they're figuring out what's acceptable for them to do, and people on the liberal end often don't think about as much. So loyalty versus betrayal. Can be something that trips people up of saying, yeah, those don't usually lead to good ideas, but you know what, it is just a reality. In-group loyalty drives a lot of decision. There are people in the world that have gotten a job simply because they bumped into somebody that went to the same school that they did and had a conversation with them over a beer one night. The guy liked them, and later they ended up with a job. You're not allowed to necessarily consider that in a formal interview if you're working for a Fortune 500 company, but that happens all the time. I have seen some really good salespeople that know every sporting team in the world. I've sat down with some of these people when I've been in trying to market clients, and they'll figure out what sporting team they like and know like 10 facts to start this conversation, and it convinces somebody that they're part of their group. This just happens to be a Michigan State game. All right, I was there when the 1979 banner went up, so just showing my loyalties there. And I think Michigan State was winning here, but it's blurry enough so you can't quite tell. But so how does this play out? When you're speaking to your member of Congress, thinking about in-group loyalty as something that they value, and you're on the conservative side, this is a table that we're going to be reviewing tomorrow with Danny. This is real data on discussion topics that were raised by Republican offices and Democratic offices during June of this year. When we look at Republican offices, aside from the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is the first one, jobs and border taxes, border adjustments, how are you going to protect our borders, were two of the main important pieces. And both of those relate to American jobs. We weren't worried about jobs in France or jobs in China or jobs in Bangladesh. We were working about our jobs in America, American jobs, and the border, which is protecting American manufacturing facilities. These are concerns that are in our group, and they reflect being worried about your own group and saying, hey, we want an American first energy policy. I tweet about America first energy policy and CF&D all the time because I think it is an American first energy policy. When you go over to the Democratic side, those topics didn't come up as often. Instead, Paris did. And in fact, Haidt had done some work that would suggest that if you asked people, who do you want to protect with a climate policy, that Republicans would be more likely to say, yes, people in my neighborhood, absolutely. People in my state, yeah. People in my country, yeah. The people in South Miami that are going to flood, I still want to protect them because they're Americans. People in Bangladesh, yeah, I don't want to harm them. But it's not who you approach them with. You don't say, let's go protect those people in Bangladesh to a conservative and think you're going to motivate them. You say, hey, let's go protect the jobs in America that we have. Whereas on the other side, he's done some polling that would suggest that people on the progressive side would say, people in my neighborhood, they'll do all right. People in the country, we're a pretty well-off country. We've got welfare. People in Miami, Florida, well, yeah, I kind of want to, especially the people that can't afford it. People in Bangladesh, now there's who I want to protect. And would prioritize people outside their group for a lot of good reasons. So if you're a progressive and you're going, yeah, that's how I feel, there's a lot of good reasons for that. They didn't cause the problem. My kids didn't cause the problem either, but they also don't have as many resources to deal with it. There's other value dimensions that come into there. But I'm bringing it up to say this is part of how this in-group loyalty plays out in how you present an issue to a Republican. Speak about their group at whatever dimension you can. Also, loyalty versus betrayal. We broadcast our loyalties really loudly on a number of issues. So if you walk into a conservative audience and you have your climate reality slides, recognize that you're broadcasting your loyalty, just like if you walked into your Democratic meeting with a Democratic member of Congress wearing your Make America Great hat again. And I'm not even going to touch on pipelines for this conversation. Authority versus subversion is another one where oftentimes we get wrapped up in conversations that conservatives hear from a authority perspective. So if you're in a discussion, this is oftentimes where the environmental justice and the conservative side can need different messaging. The beauty of CCL is that we have a policy that can help with both perspectives. But if you use messaging that speaks well to an environmental justice group, you may be sounding like what you're really trying to do is tear apart capitalism and, never let a good crisis go to waste by let's throw some other topics on this fire we got burning to keep the fire warm. There was a great article in Vox, if any of you saw it, on why Democrats shouldn't work with the market-based solution, because Democrats should claim this issue and we should pound the Republicans over the head with it. That can start sounding that way. Purity, sanctity versus degradation. This is one of the hardest dimensions for me to, in that what people consider pure and sacred and what they consider disgusting, they don't wear on their sleeve. And it behooves us to have great respect for things that other people consider pure and sacred, even if you don't. So if you've been confused about the NFL blow-up of saying, is this less respectful than this? And going, I don't get it. Understand that other people have different views of purity and sacredness that relate to the flag, that relate to the national anthem, than you might if you're on that confused side of saying, why are these people making such a big deal out of it? But I would extend it to saying, how does this play out on a climate perspective, is that we often use the flag for very different things. So the flag on the right on the left is, I think, a pretty clever little thing. Hey, the flag, the country is made up of states. Each state is a star. If you put them with corporations, you're kind of saying, you're playing with this idea that the country's really made up of corporations now with Citizens United. There's some clever things there, but you're completely ignoring the idea that people view the flag as sacred. Same with the one on the right. It's kind of a clever statement. America holds the world with a bomb on it, and we're about to blow it up. We got the matchstick. But these are playing with ideas that people consider sacred. So an example of saying, hey, so if you want to speak to conservatives, what might it look like if you want to go on a march? These are some March for Science. Here's an idea. Put the flag on a flagpole and wave it high so that people that think that the flag is sacred can see it. It's that simple. Just pay attention to what people consider sacred. Think of the things that you consider sacred in your life, and think if somebody was willing to just degrade them to make a political point to the people that they wanted to make a political point to. So that's my summary slide. So there are a bunch of great resources on Jonathan Haidt on the web. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go onto YouTube, query Jonathan Haidt, and you will come up with a wide range from On Being with Krista Tippett he's interviewed down to the Cato Institute in 2012. There's also another dimension on there. He's been interviewed by Bill Moore, you can find on YouTube. He's also been interviewed by Nick Gillespie on Reason TV, if you're at all libertarian. Just people on way different ends of the political spectrum. You can hear him talking to different audiences and hear he's got a consistent message. It's just interesting to hear the same person interviewed by that varied of a group. So I want to wrap up onto an idea from Harvard Negotiation Project that had Getting to Yes, which I would really recommend as a book, but then also Difficult Conversations was the second book I think should be like required reading in college. Difficult Conversation, the thesis behind it is saying that we often have three different levels of conversation and we don't know which one we're really in. We often talk to people as if we're having a what happened conversation, when in reality the other person might be having a feelings conversation where they're maybe a little angry because you showed up late or because the topic, they're just pissed off at somebody else about the topic you're talking to them about. And even below that, that's harder is when you think you're having a what happened conversation and you're having an identity conversation where the other person's going, no, this just says something about me as a person. So in climate change, we usually think we're having a fact-based concentration. I mean, what isn't fact-based about CO2 varied from 185 to 285 parts per million for 800,000 years on ice cores. We got real data on it, and now we're at 403 parts per million. What's not fact-based about that? I can go on the fact-based side of this for an hour, but when I'm having that conversation, I might be thinking I'm in a what happened conversation, but I might be dealing with a feelings conversation or an identity conversation, and I can trigger those very easily without being aware that the other person's in a different type of conversation than I'm in. So what I want to circle back around, sorry, to the conversation we were having earlier of saying, when you're listening to somebody, let's listen for that point of overlap. A great way to avoid triggering an identity or a feelings conversation is to find the points where you agree with somebody first and start a dialogue from those points, and then ask to step out. Ask them for permission. Even if you haven't asked that you're about to make of a member of Congress or staff, make sure you spend time starting from a point of things that you agree about, instead of just starting in saying, okay, I've got 20 minutes and I have to immediately start talking about the point I know we disagree with because that's what I really want to ask you about. And I am trying to remember what the next slide is. Yeah, okay, good. I can do one more. I did not want to trigger the video before I. We are going to do the same exercise again. And what I want you to do this time, and you're going to pair right up at the end, just like you did last time, but we're going to flip. Whoever went first last time is going to go second this time. And what I want you to do this time is when you're listening to Representative Higgins, listen for some points that you can agree with him on. Just listen as hard as you can for something that you can agree with him on. And when you turn to your partner and the audience looks to you and you start talking, convince Clay Higgins that you agree with him on something, and then make an ask from that point where you started talking. It may be a very simple ask, but convince Clay Higgins initially that you agree with him on something, and then ask to move away from that position. So as you're listening to the clip, don't just listen for the part where the green circle is way to the side. Listen for the overlap, and you'll pick up the parts you want to correct him on, but try and find the points where you can find some agreement with him on. So here we go. We're going to listen to the video clip again, and then you'll turn to your partner with a flipped. Yeah. Okay, Ricky, can we turn the volume up on the clip as the request from the audience? Okay, here we go. Oh, sorry. Well, now here we go. We'll get there. Give us just a moment. Yeah. He's really thinking about how to respond to you this time.
Having been sort of fraudulently manipulated. Well, I certainly do not disagree with the fact that climate change happens, but I do think that it's reasonable to question very carefully the science that has used models which have sometimes come under fire for having been sort of fraudulently manipulated in order to produce a result. When we talk about spending the people's treasure and the very concept of that we can fix climate change with some sort of a tax is something that I certainly take very seriously with regards to having intelligent debate about. In other words, I will not follow blindly into any endeavor that mandates the harvesting of the people's treasure. Climate change has existed well before human history. So the question is not whether or not our climate changes across the planet, nor is it really a question that the human race does have some sort of impact upon climate change. The question becomes to what degree and at what extent and what sort of time frame and how can we really best address that, and does it call for harvesting of the people's treasure?
A pregnant pause, and they look to you. And switch if you haven't. All right, I'm going to bring you back and let's refocus. An interesting opportunity. All right, so if you were going into that meeting and you were thinking, I'm going to ask Clay Higgins to support CF&D and join the Climate Solutions Caucus, I hope you would have thought I'm going to readjust my ask when you heard him say that, because that's not a very realistic ask. So I just had a couple of examples here that I'd written out, having had the opportunity to have heard it a few times. Congressman, I agree that we need to question the science. The climate has changed throughout history. I also believe that you pointed out the correct question. To what degree does the human race impact climate, and on what time frame? Dr. Tvornquist is at Tulane University and studies these past changes in climate with a focus on the coastal areas in your district. Would you be willing to speak to Dr. Tvornquist at Tulane University in Louisiana about his work on how the climate has changed historically and what caused it? Here's one other one, just on a different angle. Congress, I fully support your position that you will not follow blindly into endeavors to harvest the people's treasures. I'm concerned that environmental policies and regulatory schemes can have bad consequences on people's lives. This is why I think it's important for conservatives to develop a solution to climate change now, while Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. I believe we are at a unique moment to develop a policy that does not depress economic growth and does not strip people of their treasure. And I believe our policy is a solution that fits that category. Can I explain why I think that? Wow. So start from that position honestly, where you really believe something that he's said, and ask permission to walk away. Just take a little step out of it and work with him where he is. So that's, I'm sorry? Can you post those? I can. I'm sure we can find a way to. Yes, we will find a way to post these. And with that, I'm going to turn it over. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of this, but I'm going to turn it over to Carla and Stephanie, and we're going to switch over now and talk about messaging to progressives. So thank you for your time, and I hope that was of value.
Well, that was great. Really good. So one of the things that happened was that was a really good setup for the second half of this time, which is about communication that works with liberals and progressives, so people who self-identify as being left of center. And that's what Stephanie and I are going to talk about. I just wanted to say that the Progressive Outreach Action Team was started about a year ago. And the reason, even though most of us in this room do fit in that category of considering ourselves left of center, many of us have found that our meetings with Democrats actually don't go that well. I'm seeing a lot of nodding in the audience. Okay, so let's be honest. We expect that when we walk into a Democratic member's office, we're going to be on the same page, and it turns out that that has not been true. It hasn't been true for me with my member. It hasn't been true often when I come here to these times, and in fact, when I think about my favorite moments in lobby meetings, they happened in Republican offices. Now, that's great, except we are going to need Democratic support to pass our bill, and we don't have it yet, right? So we have to do a better job in these Democratic meetings. We just have to. So that's really what this is about. How do we have better meetings with Democrats? What are we doing that we could improve on? So that's what we're going to work on now. And I also just want to say that I've been borrowing shamelessly from CCL volunteers who I think have done a really good job about thinking about this. So some of the slides you're going to see and thinking you're going to see, it's going to be quotes, and it's not all attributed, but there's just some wonderful people within CCL who have figured some of this stuff out, and I'm just trying to provide it to you. Okay, so let's see if I can do this. Okay, this is what Stephanie and I are going to try to do today. Review a little bit about Jonathan Haidt's work when you're thinking about it from the perspective of a Democratic member of Congress. And then really talk about how do we have better meetings? What are some rules of thumb? What are some experience we've had? Talk a little bit about what's in the analysis from the June meetings that might be especially useful in your liberal meetings, right? In your meetings with liberal members. And then do some skills work like Jim did so well, pretending that we're in a meeting with a liberal member. Okay, so I just want to bring up a couple of things that going back to the work of Jonathan Haidt with thinking about how progressives and liberals tend to view what's right and wrong. And the main point here is that there's two sort of foundations that liberals tend to use much more strongly than the other three, and those are the bottom two, fairness and care. And in fact, the more strongly you self-identify, like the more liberal you consider yourself, the less likely you are to say that your in-group matters, the less likely you are to say that you feel like authority is, based on what someone in authority says, that's how you should decide what's right and wrong. In fact, The more liberal you are, the more likely you are to say, you know, I don't care if that's the president or the senator. If I think they're wrong, I'm not going to do what they say. So it's not just that 4 and 5 are important to liberals, it's that 1, 2, and 3 are often not important, particularly to people on the far left. And this is really important when we're talking about those going into meetings, and as Jim so skillfully pointed out, sometimes we don't realize that we're sort of triggering a negative reaction and triggering an identity thing with people because we just take for granted. So this is an important, well, I'm going to move on, but I want you to, when you have a Democratic meeting, just keep in mind those bottom 2, and we'll talk about how that plays out a little more. So now I'm just going to go through a few things that tend to be helpful in having better meetings with Democratic members. And again, a lot of this is borrowed. These are the things we're going to talk about: making a good connection, listening well, and responding to the objections of your Democratic members, sharing reasons for optimism, and then Stephanie's going to talk about the progressive impact of carbon fee and dividend and language and trusted allies. Connecting and becoming a trusted messenger. Okay. So you may have heard this in other trainings at CCL, but we are very, very intuitive in our reactions to people, and in fact, decide right away, very quickly, without even realizing it. We make judgments about people. And you all have probably, even if I've never met you before, you've probably made a decision already about whether you think that I can be trusted. And it happened, you know, maybe when I introduced myself to you and told you, oh, I've never really done this before, who knows? And so when you are, this is a tough thing to talk about because I don't want to make you more nervous about going into your meetings, but you should be aware that the way you introduced yourself to a Democrat is going to be something you want to think about differently than the way you introduce yourself to a Republican. And yes, we're nonpartisan, but we have to assume that people have prejudices against people on the other side of the aisle because that's the way things are right now. It's okay. I think what I want to say about this is it's okay to introduce yourself to a Democratic member of Congress in a way that lets them know that you agree with them. You know, when I've been in Republican meetings and we have people on the conservative caucus that come into the meeting and say, you know, I'm a conservative and and sort of talk about themselves in that way, there's sort of an immediate rapport. It's okay to do that with Democrats too. Yes, many of us may be left of center, but I think one of the problems we've had is that we're afraid to show that with Democrats because we're like, we're nonpartisan. And yes, we are, but you know, things that connect you to your member of Congress, maybe you are particularly concerned about the people in Bangladesh because you're a flaming liberal, okay? You don't have to hide that, right? If you're concerned about the poorest people in the world not having enough resources to protect themselves from the growing storms, it's okay to share that with a liberal member of Congress when you introduce yourself. Okay, number 2, listening. How many people have done a training at CCL about listening, like move over misconception? Okay. So for me, that was a pivotal moment in my CCL career. I think we tend to think that we know how to listen, But then once you really consider that a great meeting is at least 50% listening, it changes everything. And one of the things about Democrats is they have a range of issues and objections to what we are trying to do. And so the first thing you need to do after you introduce yourself is figure out a way to listen to the staffer or the member and figure out what is their position. Is it that, they care about climate, but they are more concerned about, in my example, preserving jobs for their rural constituents? Or is it that, they're concerned about climate, but they really, they don't believe in market-based solutions because they don't think they're going to be fair, or whatever. You need to know that. So you need to listen. And I'm just going to post the 5 top objections that I would say I and the people I've spoken with have come across in Democratic meetings. And, they're not, that you may have run across other ones, but these are things you want to find out right away. Is it a lack of trust in markets, or that market-based solutions can be effective, right? That's really common. Are they against revenue neutrality? Do they want to do something with the money besides give it back? Do they believe that working with Republicans is completely hopeless and it's never going to happen? Okay, we get that a lot. Do they really only want to talk about climate solutions that directly address environmental justice? Are they concerned about the unequal impacts of fee and dividend on low income or other disadvantaged groups? So when you go into a meeting and you ask the question, do you know about our proposal, or what solutions do you like, then you need to spend some time listening and figuring out, because these are all things that we can work on with Democrats, right? We have good answers to all of these concerns, but we need to know what they are and we need to meet them where they are. Okay. Next point. I don't think I really need to say much more about this. Okay, so, well, except in Virginia. Okay. So this is a tough time to be a Democratic member of Congress, right? They were actually demoralized before the election. And it's been a tough year to talk to Democrats, in my experience. But if that's really what you're hearing, you need to figure out what they know about our work over the past year or two, because we have a lot of things to share with Democratic members, and they don't always know it. I was surprised multiple times to find out in various meetings that Democrats in office did not know that we work all over the country. They thought maybe we were just lobbying Democrats, right? So they need to know that we're in every district, that we have good meetings with Republicans. They need to, I think the Climate Solutions Caucus has been something that some Democrats have been skeptical about. They think it's just for show. They don't really think they're going to do anything. But now, the Climate Solutions Caucus is going and giving speeches. They're blocking legislation. They're doing things. And we need to be ready to share that with our members. We need to go in armed with exactly what has happened, how fast they've grown, what they're doing, why it is not just for show. Again, every district, we lobby all the Republicans. We can't use names, but we can talk about how much things are changing in our meetings with Republicans, and that's a great thing that we have to show from the June analysis. optimism does not mean dismissing Democrats' frustrations. This is that quote about saying the right thing is sometimes it's just not saying the wrong thing. And, it's not something you want to do, contradict and say, oh, well, you're wrong to be frustrated but it does mean, I once had a meeting where the entire time the staffer spent half an hour complaining to us about how frustrating it was and what a failure everything was working on climate. And, maybe that couldn't have been avoided, but I feel like there is ideally a way to start responding to that kind of thing in a positive way. Again, maybe by picking the points of agreement and then trying to shift the conversation and share some more positive stuff. And I wish now that we would have figured out a way to limit that and to really take the conversation in a different direction. I think this is you. Yeah. We're going to switch back and forth a few times.
Just to keep your attention, mostly. So the fourth way you can talk to Democrats about our policy and make your meetings go a little bit better is to talk about how progressive our policy is. Jim sort of mentioned that our policy is nice because it appeals to both sides of the spectrum, but they're, at the end of the day, especially when you look at the different versions of carbon taxes that exist, our policy really is kind of in the middle, but it's one of the most progressive ones. So you really want to point out our two studies, the REMI study and the household impact study. Both of those do a really good job of showing how carbon fee and dividend is good. It's not perfect, but it's really good at protecting low-income households from rising energy prices and rising prices of products. And it's important to point this out in your progressive meetings. The household impact study, I would assume most members of Congress have seen this, but it's nice because you can break it down to your specific district and show them how their constituents come out. And mentioning that it's a net progressive effect, that overall the policy is progressive. So this is just one example of a graph from the household impact study. And basically it's showing that those on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder come out much better with the dividend than those that are wealthier. And this plays right into that idea of fairness. One of the other objections that you'll hear a lot is, well, a dividend's not fair, the low income should get more. Why does Bill Gates get the same share as somebody who is not wealthy? And I think this really speaks to that is, yes, they come out, they get the same amount, but that dividend matters a lot more to somebody who doesn't have as much money. It makes a bigger difference to their pocketbook. And you can actually see that for the highest quintiles, they lose a little bit under this policy just because they're spending so much money because they have a bigger carbon footprint. And then, I'm going to talk about using trusted messengers and some of the language that we should be using. So I'm sure you're all very aware that we have some really great spokespeople that work with CCL, and we use their language a lot. Catherine Hayhoe, Bob Inglis, Jerry Taylor, and they're all conservative, which is great. They have these incredible messages. They really speak to that idea that we're resonating with the other side. But I think it's important to remember that when you're having a meeting with a progressive, that may not resonate as well. So we're going to talk about some progressive messengers that you can use instead. So Bernie Sanders, very liberal. He has submitted a carbon tax in the last few Congresses. His is more progressive than ours. It spends the money, but it's still a really good example of a Democrat independent, that supports the idea of pricing carbon. The Pope has also spoken a lot about this. If you have a religious member of Congress, he is a great example of somebody you can bring up that talks about carbon pricing, doesn't support our policy necessarily, but you can, again, bring up this idea that there are liberal messengers that want a carbon price. And then Obama is a really good one. He also has, been careful about what he says about pricing carbon, but or about carbon taxes and dividends, but he's been very vocal about pricing carbon, and that's the best first step. And so I really suggest that you use these messengers when you're talking in Democratic meetings. And then we have a whole host of people, actual elected members of Congress, that have submitted some type of carbon pricing bill. Not all of these are carbon taxes. Some of them are cap and dividend or cap and trade, but these are some really great examples. If your member says, I'm really interested in this policy, but I want to talk to somebody about how you write it, or maybe what some of the more progressive versions are, you can direct them to any of these members and say, you should talk to your colleagues. These people have supported this effort in the past. And so I just wanted to go over some other tips about terms when you're talking to Democratic offices. So one of the things Carla mentioned was the care, harm, fairness. And so when you think about progressives and liberals, we progressive liberals tend to care about the lowest income. We tend to care about the most disadvantaged. So saying that this will benefit all households, or the dividend goes back to all households rather than American households, tends to have a little bit better of a reception. Saying corrective to the market rather than market-based, market-friendly. This again goes to this idea that we want to fix what's broken instead of playing into the status quo. The idea of fairness and care. We want to make sure that we're fixing the things that are wrong, rather than no, everything's going to stay the same, but we're just going to make it a little better. And then one of the other things that Jonathan Haidt talks about that wasn't mentioned yet is liberals and progressives tend to have a openness to new experiences, and we like change and new things. And so talking about the transformative power of a rising carbon fee, and that it's going to change the markets, it's going to change things, it's going to take us away from fossil fuels, those are really powerful messages that progressives want out of a policy. And then again, just mentioning the lowest income that suffer the most from climate change have the most to gain from a very swift transformation to a low carbon economy. And then one other one that's not up here that I think is also really important is don't bash the Clean Power Plan. There's a lot of progressive liberal organizations that worked on that policy. There's a lot of members of Congress that worked on that policy. Their staff may have, come from the Obama administration. And it doesn't do us any favors to go in and bash a policy that really was kind of the only thing that was available at that time. So it's important to acknowledge that. It's fine if you want to, compare our policy to that. I think that's a totally fine conversation to have, but you really want to thank them and acknowledge that, we see that as a great policy solution as well. So these are just a quick review, and then Carla's going to come back up and we're going to do one of our exercises. So just remember, become a trusted messenger. It's okay to say that you're a Democrat. Listen and respond to their objections, figure out what it is about our policy that they don't like, sharing progress and reasons for optimism, focusing on the progressive impact of carbon fee and dividend, again, the REMI household impact study, and then remembering to use the right, left language, and that using trusted validators can really make a big difference. Okay, back to you.
Yeah. sometimes we, in the trusted validators, sometimes we do try to find one of Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben, it's tricky because, you know, we're talking to everybody, and just the way Al Gore is a real trigger, again, you know, Republicans often are going to react very negatively towards him. Same is true for Bill McKibben. So, you know, we have to be. For speaking to Democrats, absolutely. Yeah. So, and handle with care. There you go. Yeah. Right. Thanks. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the next exercise, which is really about similar in a sense to with what happened with the clip, that except we're going to play both parts. We're not going to watch a video. Really, what I'd like you to do again is pair up, and maybe try pairing up with someone new instead of the person that you did before, just so you can have a different experience. But wait, I want to talk to you first. Don't move. So what I'd like you to do is in your pair, one person is going to play the part of a Democratic member of Congress or staffer who is going to voice one of these objections in your own words. And maybe you can do this because you've been in a meeting where the Democrat has an issue, or maybe you want to use one of the things that you've heard today. I'm just going to give you an example of a couple things I've heard from my member, which you're welcome to borrow. I'm skeptical of market-based approaches for fixing environmental problems, and I prefer regulations. Or here's another one. It's too easy to game the system with market-based approaches, which is why I opposed cap and trade in 2010. Okay? And here's a third. The rural folks in my district will be harmed under carbon fee and dividend. They have to drive long distances and they don't have a lot of money, and I think they would suffer if gas prices went up under this plan. So I'm not going to support anything that hurts the rural folks in my district. So you're welcome to use one of those. One of you, the person who's been to the fewest CCL conferences can start. I'd like you to voice your objection, and then I'd really like the other person, if you've been to a listening workshop, to listen very, very attentively and really take in what they're saying as if you've never heard it before, and really think about, and then instead of replying with your response, reply with, "This is what I heard. I heard you say that you have this issue." And then the first person is going to have a chance to say yes, or actually you got it wrong, I was actually saying this. And then if you have a way of then, once you are sure what you heard, coming up with one sentence or two sentences of a way to trying to address that, validate and address the concern. So I'd like it to go back and forth twice. And so because that's a little bit of a long thing, I think, what do you think, 4 minutes for that, or 2? 4 minutes, and then we're going to talk about it for a sec. Okay, so if you've had a chance to do that and you want to try switching roles, now's your chance to do that. Okay, wrap it up, please. All right. So I just want to tell you that it does look like we're doing well with time, so we should really have some time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So I'm not going to try to do that now, but I'm glad everybody seemed really like they were doing things. I'm going to turn it back over to, let's see, my clicker isn't working. Oh, okay. All right. I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie in a sec, but I want to say one other thing about the liberals liking new experiences and being open to change. This is a quote that I love, and I know it's long, but every time I read it, I think this is just one of the most wonderful responses to liberals about why we need carbon fee and dividend. And this was in testimony before Congress. Charlie Komanoff, who's the guy behind the Carbon Tax Center, said this: the U.S. energy system is so diverse, and our economic system, I'm trying to read it to you, so decentralized, and our species so varied and innovating that no subsidies regime, no matter how enlightened, and no system of rules and regulations, no matter how well-intentioned, can elicit the billions of carbon-reducing decisions and behaviors that a swift, full-scale transition from carbon fuels requires. At the same time, nearly all of those decisions and behaviors share a common crucial element. They are affected and even shaped by the relative prices of available or emerging energy sources, systems, and choices. And to me, that's really the best response to the idea that we need something more transformative than a carbon tax. We need, to tear down the system, or we need this or we need that to solve climate change. Because really, all of us, no matter whatever we think of capitalism, we all behave in the manner that Charlie Kamenoff talks about. We all respond to price signals. We do it every day. And so I just really like this quote. I think you should use it in whatever way you can. Maybe it'll change your thinking about how to communicate with Democrats when they object to the idea of carbon fee and dividend as like, well, that won't be enough or that won't work. Really, he's saying it's the only thing that will work. Okay, so.
Okay, so we're going to do one more exercise, but before we do, I just wanted to touch really quickly on, and Danny's going to talk about this more tonight, but what was in the June notes that should resonate with Democratic offices and kind of how you can talk about those. So these were the top issues for Democrats from June. So the first was the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is pretty cool that this was the #1 topic. And it shows that Democrats are at least aware about it. What Carla was saying, that some of them don't know. It seems like most of them should know by now. They've met with us enough times. And so if it comes up in your meeting, you should keep encouraging them to work across the aisle to try to find a Republican. I know for some of them that's frustrating and impossible. And maybe another way you can word it is, maybe you can't find a Republican that wants to join with you, but could you maybe have a conversation with a Republican about the caucus and what it's doing to at least keep climate change as a topic of discussion, to really keep bringing it up on the floor or in the halls, just to make sure that that topic rises to the top of people's priority lists. The second topic that was brought up by Democrats was the Paris Climate Agreement. So this one, if you think about the timing of when we went to the Hill, makes sense because it was right after Trump had announced that he was going to pull us out. So it will be interesting to see if this comes up again this time. But if it does, it's helpful to remind Democrats about how much is still happening here at home. There's entire contingents of cities and mayors in Bonn right now that are still in and working towards the goals. And you can also point out that there's state work happening on climate, and that not all Republicans supported Trump leaving. A few of the Republicans on the caucus wrote a letter to Trump telling him not to pull out. So there are pockets of hope that you can show them surrounding Paris. And then the top 3 and 4 issues were tied, and that was jobs and the dividend. And so for these, I really suggest pointing to our studies. So for the jobs one, it kind of depends on for the dividend one, it depends on what the question was. If they're asking, how does the dividend affect my constituents? That's when you want to show them the household impact study. If it's a question of, how does the dividend work? How do you get that back to people? What does that look like? That's where you can invite them to the Friday briefings, which Danny will talk about tonight. But it is going to be about that dividend delivery study that we did a year ago. And then if they're talking about jobs, again, it kind of depends on the topic, but pointing them to the REMI study, showing what the jobs outlooks looks like for their region is a really good conversation to have. Okay, so before we go to lunch, we're going to do one more exercise. So this one is going to be similar to Jim's. So we found a member of Congress who had seen a lot of the problem, or has heard a lot of the objections raised from some of your meetings and our meetings in the past. So we had him do a quick little meeting interview. Basically, you'll see. It's a video of a member of Congress who's gonna, from a Democratic perspective, and We want you to do the same thing that you did with Jim's clip, really listen, find points of agreement, and you're going to be able to turn to your partners again and practice what you would respond. And for this one, the person with the longest hair goes first. Sorry if that's a sensitive topic. Okay. So you're going to have to be quiet so you can hear it. Oh. Wait.
Hi, and thank you for coming to my office. You're with the Citizens Climate Lobby, is that right? Nice to meet you. Beverly, could you get me that file on the environment? Thanks. You know, I'm big on the environment. You know my record. I'm all over it. But I have to say, your proposal, it's very ambitious, okay? There's no way you're going to get anything like this through in this Congress. We're going to have to just wait. And Trump will certainly veto anything like this, even if you could get it through. So... But I have a concern. When I hear these things about pricing carbon and cap and trade and all that, I wonder about low-income residents. How will they fare in such an environment? We need to protect those who often get left behind. And I'm afraid that when you're talking about pricing carbon, who's going to suffer? Who's going to win? You know, I wonder about that. But with this, with your proposal, you're talking about carbon fee and dividend. Now that dividend... I'm wondering, though, if we could take some of that dividend and divide it up so that, yeah, sure, some goes to the households, but what if we can take some of that money and invest in the green infrastructure, right? And projects to reduce emissions, because I'm very big about the environment, and we need money to, to put towards renewable energy. So those are some of my thoughts, and thank you for coming to my office. You don't have to convince me. All right, I'm already convinced, but it's the other side you need to work on. Okay, thank you very much.
So go ahead and discuss. I was going to tell. I thought I made that kind of clear. She always looks very fashionable. Yeah.
Wow. I was like,
She's Mark's assistant.
she's Mark's assistant. So she always dresses.
No. She always jokes that this is her one chance to get to dress up. It's freezing up here. Organs. Did you switch if you haven't switched?
They should just be able to go to community after, like sometime next week and look at for conference presentations. Yeah.
I figured it was at least a week out.
Yeah.
I've learned my lesson of this hotel. Lots of layers. Yeah, sorry I said it. Okay. So I just want to make it clear this is not an actual member of Congress. This is Peterson Toscano, and if you guys see him around, you should thank him because he was kind enough to make this video for us. They're actual points from notes over the years that Democrats have had. So they was all real talking points. It was just, we had Peterson give us a video. Okay, and before we go to Q&A, I'll come back to this. We just wanted to talk a little bit about the two action teams that work on this messaging and how you guys can get involved.
Yes, so the Conservative Caucus, I'll make a quick pitch for, is we are a group of people that identify as right of center, where we're trying to be trusted messengers, and we get out and speak to college Republicans, Young Americans for Liberty. We go table at national conventions. Peter Bryn was tabled at CPAC of last year. Craig Preston just led a group that included some conservatives and some progressives, where we had 20 people going to the California State GOP state convention and tabling. And we do that kind of activity where we try and hold together. We are a group of people that self-identify right of center that are working to be trusted messengers to people on the right. And I'd be happy to talk further with anybody that's interested.
And with progressive messaging, with that action team, it's just a new action team, just been going for a year, and we have been working on doing better with liberals in general, members of Congress, and also public outreach and all kinds of groups that Democratic parties in communities and that kind of thing. I am looking for people, volunteers, who are interested in helping to lead the Progressive Outreach Action Team. If this is something that you want to work on, please talk to me today, because I really need some assistance in the leadership of this team, and there's a lot to be done, and it's really fun.
And she's brilliant and great to work with.
You don't even need a microphone. And then one other thing to mention, there's also an environmental justice action team that focuses specifically on the far left that work on environmental justice topics. And that is led by Marty Roach. And that is also, you can find on Community. So I recommend, they overlap a little bit with Progressive, but they're definitely separate messaging and separate conversations. So if you're interested in that one as well, you can email me and I can direct you to the right people. Labor. And Labor is Dave Masson, if you want to reach out to Labor. Okay. Questions? Oh my gosh. There's a microphone going around.
Right, coming down from there. Here we go.
Behind you. Oh.
Hello? Hello?
Yep.
Oh, hi. My representative is a Republican, and he's a proponent of, he's actually part of the caucus, but he also has a large refinery that he's been a proponent of. What does any of these studies, what will happen to fossil fuel jobs as, you know, for some of these studies that you show, won't they be the losers, and how would you talk to that to a person like this?
Yeah, so I'll address that at two levels. You know, what will happen? Part of our goal is to move away from using fossil fuels. And creative destruction is something where there will be some jobs that are created and some jobs that aren't as prevalent in the future. However, if you're dealing with a refinery that's not taking in Canadian tar sand oil, one of the reasons that many oil and gas companies like a carbon tax policy is because we don't immediately say you have to stop using petroleum products. And the shift for our transportation industry is not going to be immediate, and there is a life cycle that they can project out against. And even on the electrical power generation, a price on carbon really quickly makes it so that you don't want to use coal, but natural gas that companies are very good at drilling for right now survives for quite a while. Even if you look at the REMI report, you can say, hey, how long does natural gas combined cycle survive? And we project that there's a good life cycle for those investments. It just doesn't go out forever. So I would stress, if I were speaking to him, I would bring up that you know, the Climate Leadership Council does have a bunch of oil and gas companies that support it, and that this is a policy that gives them some assurance and gives them an environment that they can invest wisely in.
Okay, and then
Yeah. So the alternative, there are alternatives where people try and take things away quicker, where you just say, okay, you know what, we're just not going to make internal combustion engines after 2020. Yeah.
folks, so you all can remain seated. Bring the mic to you.
Thank you. One quick point, if you're not aware of it, is something you could tell people. Our carbon fee and dividend schedule would take 9 or 10 years to increase the cost of gasoline at the pump by $1 a gallon. We've been there before. It's not all that startling or radical or difficult to adjust to. My question, though, is right now, we're going to be talking to people who are consumed with the question of tax reform. And the carbon tax discussions that are out there already tend more to use the carbon tax to offset other tax cuts and help close the revenue gap. It's very different from what we're proposing, but how do we talk about that? I don't think we can ignore it because it's what's on the table right now.
So I can take a stab at that. That is a conversation that's been happening in DC. I will say that it's mostly been happening in think tanks and not quite as much on the Hill. Most Republicans I've seen have sort of said that's dead on arrival. It's not possible. It works in theory, except for that the point of carbon tax is that it decreases over time. So at some point, you're going to have to find a way to offset those corporate taxes that you just cut with some other source of revenue. So, yeah, I think it will come up in your meetings. I have a feeling that Democrats will probably be the ones that bring it up because they'll see this as an opportunity. There's a few, I believe, Representative Larson, I think, was trying to bring carbon tax into the debate of tax reform. So yeah, it's a tricky subject. CCL's sort of stance on it is that we believe it should be a standalone bill because the dividend is what's going to be required to make sure people end up okay. If you're just throwing it in tax reform, there's no dividend, and you're going to have people that have to pay much higher energy prices with no way to offset that.
Hi, my name's Jeff Jocelyn. I'm from Atlanta. I love your presentation. Thank you. I heard Haight on NPR. I think it might have been Terry Gross interviewing him, and it's excellent. I'd recommend finding it. What I was wondering when I was listening to him was using this for writing letters to the editor or op-eds. And I think there's some like crossover where you can use his work, like say American values. There are some values that both sides share. Is there any way you can address how this might be used to speak to a group that's both Democrats and Republicans and hit some of these points that he says are important?
So I'll jump in. And so if it's a group, by definition, the group probably has some commonality. So I would focus on figuring out what that commonality is. So if you're in front of a Trout Unlimited, that's a group that would contain Republicans and Democrats, or a good mix of people. Speak to the group and speak to their values. I do think that some of it is even then pulling back on messaging that could kick whichever side you're trying to keep in the dialogue. That we often alienate people as much as we do reach out to them in how we phrase things. Yeah.
I think that's a great question, and I think that's true. A first step is to be aware of things that tend to alienate people on either extreme side and leave that out. It is possible to have fairly neutral language about this, but you have to really think about it beforehand. And I want to give you a couple of examples of finding a way to speak to the values of the group and really trying to focus on that. Audubon is an organization that has lots of people on both sides of the aisle in it. I didn't know that, but I was invited to go speak to an Audubon chapter, and there's just as many Republicans in Audubon as there are Democrats. But, everybody there is all about birds, of course. And birds are one of the most vulnerable species or groups of any organism to climate change, and so birds and coral, yeah. So it was very easy to talk to them about the data out there about what's happening to birds. There is an element, one of the ways that the purity issue sometimes gets framed is about sort of preserving nature from the past, which is something I think that sort of cuts across political divisions. So that was a really good group to practice on. And the other example I would say, just to think about, is Rotary Club, which is not partisan, but a lot of small business folks. They have a motto, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's essentially talking about their core values, and it sounds just like CCL, right? So if you can find what the group is about and sort of speak to that, a lot of times, if you know that it's going to be, not far on the left or on the right, that's a really good way in. I I don't know if that helps, but hopefully.
I'd just like to add one thing on there that somebody coached me on Rotary. So they have a four-way test
That's
of
it.
how do they pick
That's-
projects. They have four
Yeah.
dimensions that you need to get past. And if you have the opportunity, speak to somebody in the group and say, here's my messaging, how do you think it matches? Because I've had people coach me to say, okay, don't just use don't speak to them about the four-way test as if you're an expert on it, because that's what they've been doing, and you're just, I don't know about the four-way test. So if you have an opportunity to speak to somebody in that group and say, hey, here's my messaging, how does it play with your group? That's a great Yeah, and Karen Hans is right back there. She is our Rotary lead for CCL and is very active in the Rotary on the environmental side.
Her work is invaluable.
I agree.
Over on the right side, near the front door, I guess the left side if you're looking forward. So Peter Brent, I just have a comment to add, not necessarily a question. The question was raised before about refineries in your district. I wanted to add one thing to what Jim said. Being from Texas, the biggest oil producer and the biggest gas producer in the country, this is a very, 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 very sensitive topic for us. And one thing that I would point out is if you're in a Republican office, especially one with oil and gas interest, I will differ with one thing Jim said. I never, ever, ever use the words, we're trying to move away from fossil fuels. I use the words, we're trying to reduce emissions. Those are two very different things. It opens the door for things like carbon capture and sequestration, which if you're in Texas, that's a solution, a no carbon solution. If you have refining, Jim, I think, was very right to point out that a transition away from oil, we'll use it more efficiently with a carbon fee, but oil's going to be around for a good long time. So I think that the beauty of a carbon fee is it allows industries to figure out the most efficient and effective way for them to respond however they choose to. So if you're in an oil and gas area, in a Republican area, I would say we're trying to reduce emissions. We are agnostic to what energy solution that is. It's got to be safe, it's got to be environmentally responsible, but we're not picking winners and losers. So I would just add that to the conversation.
Hello.
Yep, you're on.
Hi. You can hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. My name is Dave Masson. I'm from San Francisco. And so as to not yell from my seat, I'd like to point out that CCL actually has 3 action teams on the left: progressive outreach, environmental justice, and labor outreach. And I'm coordinating the labor outreach action team, and I would love to have some assistance with that as well. We are learning more and more about unions' views about climate change. Many are not especially on board. They're very, very busy defending their members, in part because now we have an anti-labor president. But we're making some slow progress. To expand on what Jim mentioned, for job losses for fossil fuel folks, these are quite gradual. We got some percentages from REMI. There's a chart in the full REMI report. Well, there's actually a national chart and then one for each region showing numbers of job losses. REMI also gave us what's that in terms of percentages of current employment. The very worst case is oil and gas development losing 23% over 20 years. Well, that's just a little over 1% per year. There's another report by Perry showing that they use a 20-year period as well. And 87% of the job loss could be covered through routine retirement. So there's definitely some hope there. On Wednesday, I'm meeting with the steelworkers, legislative director here in DC, and I expect to learn more from her. And so we'll be able to share more. Steelworkers work in the refineries, so I should be able to get some good information from her that I can share.
Hi there, Eric Fine from Connecticut.
Thanks so much for this whole workshop. It's been great. You talked about messaging for Democrats, messaging for Republicans. I have a question about messaging from the Democrats to the Republicans. And as is probably the case with a lot of us, we have a Democratic member who's interested but needs to find a partner. And there's a long line and probably lots of strategies to help them find a partner. I love the idea of breaking the spiral of silence just by you saying they should start talking about it. But what other talking points do you think we can hand the Democrats to talk to the Republicans about the caucus?
So, just to clarify, you mean other ways to get them to talk to Republicans, not necessarily joining the caucus?
Talking points that a Democrat could make to help find, to help talk about the caucus in general and help find a Republican partner to go into the caucus with.
Yeah. I think some good ways to do it would be encouraging them to talk to a member that they work with on another topic, and possibly finding an inroads with that. Maybe it's healthcare, and they can talk about the public health aspect of emissions. I think a lot of times you'll find that if you really kind of talk to the staff and the members, they'll know who they work with best, and kind of, you know, maybe there's somebody who you work with on a different topic, not necessarily on environment. Think of somebody that's way outside of what you normally work with on, who you normally work with on environment things, and that may spark their interest. I'm trying to think of what else. You can have them reach out about state stuff. You know, if there's a member within their state party that they would work with best. It is tricky, and I know that a lot of Democrats are kind of feeling dejected about not being able to find a partner. But again, I really do think that just having those conversations about climate is just as important as getting them on the caucus, because there's plenty of Republicans who, for whatever reason, can't join the caucus, but are pretty there on climate. And so I still think that there's value in having those conversations without necessarily joining the caucus. And maybe just telling your member that, saying, you know, it's just as valuable that you have these conversations on the floor in groups as it is to be on the caucus, that those conversations need to happen regardless. I hope that helps. You may want to ask this question again tonight to Danny. He may have some other ideas.
Hi, I'm Sudhir Shukla from Silver Spring, Maryland. I haven't had a lot of pushback in my in meetings with progressives, but so I was wondering if you could, if you have any ideas, you know, in case we do receive questions about the impact on rural members of their district, you know, who have to drive long distances for their daily needs, and also concerns about wanting to about environmental justice and wanting to invest in green infrastructure, et cetera.
So if you go to, there's so many resources now that CCL has broken down by district and by state. And one of the things that is really been helpful for me with my member who's brought up this rural issue again and again is that the household impact study shows both by district and by state all of the different categories of income and how they will be affected by carbon fee and dividend, and also by age and race. There, have you seen that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So that is, and by rural, suburban, and urban. So one of the things, this is one of those things where sometimes data doesn't get through as much as it should. The data that we have is incredibly positive in showing that, in fact, whether you're rural is not really very important compared to whether you're rich in what your carbon footprint is like. And so the idea that rural constituents are going to be disproportionately harmed or even harmed at all is just not true from the data that we have. And so I think for me, the most effective way has been to respectfully really try to present that data in a way that the member or the staffer is willing to look at. So I would just really go back to that. But the other thing I would do is present data about how much of our carbon footprint comes from gasoline consumption and how much comes from the stuff that we purchase, because that's pretty compelling. And also the data about how much gas prices will rise with a $15 a ton fee on carbon, which is 15 cents or less, where we've seen these fluctuations in gas prices so much bigger than that. So those are some places I think to start. Was that your whole question?
And if you have some time talking about concerns about environmental justice and green infrastructure investment.
I think if you're having a meeting where environmental justice is a big topic, you have to acknowledge that carbon fee and dividend is just not going to address a lot of those issues, and that's totally okay to say. We should own that. That there's a zillion complementary policies that are going to have to happen to address those issues. I do think it's important, especially when you're meeting with members of Congress. I think they get the political context a little more than when you're having conversations with the public. They get that there's no way you're going to pass something that ties spending. Like, that's just not really going to work in this Republican-controlled environment. And so explaining that if you start tying projects and programs to a dividend, you're going to lose a lot of this Republican support that we've been gaining. Talking about the politics of it really resonates, especially with staffers on the Hill. They understand why we try to keep it revenue neutral and the benefits of that.
Okay, folks, so we're going to do one more question with the other mic, and then we're going to go to one mic. If you have a question, please get in line, and we will try our best to get to you. Thank you.
Hi, I want to revisit the best response to those, not just in Congress, but among our own numbers, who want to earmark revenues to build green infrastructure or somehow legislate more responsible energy choices. And then the one that I haven't heard today yet is to please talk about resiliency. One of the things that I'm hearing is we need to invest in building more resiliency into especially our coastal cities. And that's in conflict with perhaps CCL's policy.
I don't think resiliency is in conflict. There's actually a lot of bills that are getting introduced on resiliency, and that actually is a topic where Republicans are pretty on, at least the Republicans on the caucus are pretty on board with that. I think resiliency and adaptation is a lot more palatable a lot of times to people than mitigation, and to talk about them as complementary pieces to this puzzle, that we're going to need both. You can't just start bailing out the boat until you plugged up the hole. So I don't see them at odds. I think you can talk about them together. And I don't remember the first part of the question.
Earmarks and green infrastructure.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. So just to clarify the question, are you wanting to talk about what is a constructive response to Democrats or liberals who want to invest the money in green energy projects or green infrastructure? Okay, so I personally think that our most powerful argument for 100% revenue neutrality with liberals is the case for progressive, I hesitate to use the term redistribution because that's not what we're talking about exactly, but essentially the progressive impact of carbon fee and dividend is significant. If you keep all of the money and give it back equally, and you have an extreme association between carbon footprint and wealth, the impact is extremely progressive. Those people on the lower end of the income scale are protected against the rising energy prices, and in fact, some people benefit pretty substantially. That's our best argument, really. I mean, when you start peeling off pieces of it for other uses, that diminishes. Our other best argument is that once people are getting the dividend, they are never going to let this policy go away because they're going to love it. And those two things really, I think if you can really get those across, are our strongest cases to talk to Democrats with. But I think the third thing I would say about the green infrastructure question is that sometimes when you're talking to liberals and they're objecting to the dividend, what they're really objecting to is the idea that a straight carbon fee and dividend will fix the problem. Because many liberals, and I say this with, I don't say this, I say this with love. Many liberals do not fully understand or embrace the market economy and how it works. And so if you really can talk about the fact that you're going to buy the cheapest thing and that fee and dividend is going to slowly increase the cost of everything with fossil fuel and carbon embedded in it, really getting that idea across is a way to convince a lot of liberals if they really understand why it works.
So I'll just add to that last one. So this is more speaking to conservatives, but on the same point. Businesses, I often break it down into two camps. On the price signal, businesses calculate it immediately. I know sustainability managers, they price out solar panels, the payback period 17 years, their window is 3.5 years. It's a no-go. If you can, the price signal, they do it. They do it very well. People, there is really good data out there on price of gasoline and what cars people buy. People respond to those price signals unconsciously, though we wouldn't say we do. You can look out there at the price of gas and what cars the general population in America buys, and we do respond to those price signals. The data is there to be able to go in and say, this is really how we behave. We just don't actually calculate out the full life cost of a F-150 pickup truck. We don't say we're doing it, but it affects us.
Hi, I've got a question that kind of follows up on that same sort of problem, which is I've heard from liberal audiences a couple of times, how can this carbon dividend thing be fair when, you've got people driving SUVs and they're wasting energy, and you've got corporations that are polluting the environment. You're really not doing anything. You're really not affecting those people who are trashing our world. Do you get what I'm saying?
I'll jump onto that one. So people don't burn gasoline. Companies don't burn gasoline. Companies refine it. You and I burn gasoline. Companies do not burn gasoline in transportation. You and I burn gasoline. So the concept that people are pissed off at a bunch of oil refineries because they're refining petroleum and selling it us so we can burn it and emit CO2, I find a little bit ironic. But I put my Ben Shapiro hat on for a moment. Sorry, I'll let these guys respond.
But it's also this concern that the dividend is rewarding bad people. Do you get what I'm saying? It's rewarding everybody, including those people who drive SUVs.
It's rewarding people that have the lowest carbon footprint.
Yeah. I wouldn't say you're rewarding. It basically, the bigger argument I think you can make if you have that coming up is that it goes to changing behavior a little bit, but it's really more about the overall economy changes that happen, that you are going to have car companies that aren't going to be making SUVs anymore because it's not going to be economical. It's the investment, that signal is going to change where capital investments are made, and that's really what trickles down to changing the behavior. It's less about changing yes, the dividend does help, like, yeah, it can change behavior, but if you're somebody who's wealthy, you can just, it's not going to change your behavior that much. It's more about the products that you're going to start buying, the things you're going to start seeing in the economy. It's going to happen whether you on a personal level decide it or not. You can make it better for yourself, but the change is going to happen economy-wide regardless of how you feel about it.
Hi, I'm John Seeger from Idaho. Real red state. Our issue, and Jim, we talked a little bit about this yesterday. One of our major issues is we kind of get some success talking that fact-based discussion as you were talking about, but then it becomes kind of that identity discussion. And what does this say about me? And so our trouble is, even when we win people over in private, trying to get, whether they're a member of Congress or even business leaders, others, trying to get them to come out even in support of just to admit, hey, climate change is real. That can be difficult because they're asking themselves, well, what's my base going to think about this? And what are the PACs going to think about this? And are they going to still fund me? Or more importantly, what we're hearing is, are they going to fund somebody against me in the primary if I come out in front of climate change? So I was wondering if you could give us some hints on how to deal with that.
Yeah, I would love to take that one first, and you guys can add on to this. So I think that is what CCL is all about, is dealing with that exact issue. So let's break down your in speaking to a member of Congress and their concerns when they're about PACs and primaries. That dialogue is much more speaking to your Republican members of Congress, which, as I recall, you said you had 2 Republican representatives and 2 Republican senators, and that's the way it was going to be for a while. So their main election is in the primary. First point, I would be very respectful in having a dialogue with them on depending on how well you know the staff, can depend on whether you actually might even want to talk about this more directly. But pre-primaries versus post-primaries in their season for 2018, if somebody is trying to run for the House, they have to raise like $2 million every 2 years. Have you ever done a fundraiser and had to raise $1 million a year every year just to keep your job? That's a pretty amazing thing to put on. So pre-primary versus post-primary are different worlds for them. All the PAC money, I think, is really important, and I think we shouldn't be naive to think there isn't a lot of money being thrown out around there. But all of the money is going to buy votes. So if you can bring people in writing to their member of Congress, if you can use the CCL model to have more communication going into that member of Congress, they start understanding that there is some grassroots support for activity in their district. And the more you can spread out to having conservatives, trusted messengers within your group, to find people that will just write them a letter and say, hey, I think climate change is an important issue, even if they're not fully on board. We hold the money is all trying to buy votes. And grassroots is just another way at having those votes communicate to the member of Congress what they think is important, that the member of Congress also listens to. So that is with the CCL model of saying, we're not a C4 that's going to go raise $1 billion and start handing it out to people that vote for climate change resolutions. That's not our position in this movement. Our position is out there having constituents speak to their members of Congress.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Mark Pullman from Springfield, Massachusetts area. Our newly formed CCL chapter met with our Democratic congressman who's been in Congress a long time. And his objection or concern was the NIMBY people, the people that don't want to have climate things done in their backyard. Is this an area that's addressed by the CCL, and if so, how do we address that problem?
You mean wind farms?
Not in my backyard, the NIMBY.
Yeah. So the wind farms is a common one there. I will say, no, I won't use. I was working, when I first started trying to have a voice in this space, I was working with a regional environmental group that was anti-coal, anti-nuclear, and they agreed to do a movie on climate change. I said, okay, I'll get involved with your group and I'll run a movie on climate change and a panel and do all this, and I was coordinating it. And the executive director came in and said, hey, one of our big donors just asked us to like fight the wind farms that are going up in an unnamed region in an unnamed state. And I said, wait, you guys are against coal, you're against nuclear, and you're gonna be against wind? Like, what are you for? And they were just, but it's a big funder. It's a big donor of ours. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think that's a real issue that you just got to be willing to push back on and say, that's one of CCL's strengths, is that that's one of the things that drew me to this organization, is that we are agnostic on these other issues, and communities need to have some rights to make up some decisions on what's appropriate in their community. But that's, those are community decisions. You can't, yeah, I don't know. I'll let you.
Well, I just wanted to add one thing about that. To me, the best way of responding to that might be to talk about the fact that we are working on a national level, and we are not promoting any particular form of energy. What we are promoting is that we have to get off of things that emit carbon. And so I would probably try not to engage in those local issues. Say that's an issue for Massachusetts to deal with. We're talking about the bigger problem that we need to, in order to protect, our coastlines and everything that we hold dear here. We're trying to get an orderly system to get off of carbon emitting fuels. I just think that getting into those kind of issues is a distraction from what we're trying to do, is kind of a way to maybe think about it. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you.
And these three questions will wrap up with the three people in line.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Bart Schoenfeld. I'm from upstate New York, Columbia County, and I'm a physician, and there is a great concern among the national health community regarding the impacts of climate change. And I've found that that's a subject that seems to resonate on both sides of the aisle, but I think the way I communicate it is a little bit different when I speak to Democrats versus Republicans. I wanted to get your opinion, and in Republican offices, I'll be more talking about the costs of health care, whereas in the Democratic offices, I'm talking more about how the disadvantaged and lower-income groups are more affected. And I'd just like to think if you have any thoughts about any of that.
So I'd just add, so in the Republican offices, I wouldn't go at the disadvantaged aspect, but I would talk about the health of yeah, no, in Republican offices, you're talking about the numbers.
The cost.
Right.
The cost.
The thing I'm adding on there is that don't think that the Republicans aren't concerned about the health issues also. So there's a bunch of the Conservative Energy Network, the state affiliates all across the country that are picking up renewable portfolio standards and other state-level issues that speak a lot about the health impacts of asthma and point out those health impacts by name and that are people also, without saying this is about caring for people that don't have as much income. But because those health impacts spread across, all of us. So just on the Republican side, don't be afraid to name them by name and make the emotional connection to people in your district also.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that.
My name is Rich Green from Charlotte. In the past few months, we've had some hurricanes and fires. How would that be brought up in the conservative and progressive offices?
Sure. So I'll talk. So fires, I haven't pulled the data, but I've looked at it in Western North Carolina where we had some fires a couple of years ago. Fires you can usually attribute to dry seasons, and you can pull up real data that says, our rainfall has been low. This is what was projected, that we'd have bigger swings in whether it's dry or wet, and this is what we're seeing in an outcome as fires. and you can say, hey, these are symptoms of the problem that were predicted, and this is what we should expect, and this is one of the reasons I'm personally concerned. Hurricanes get a lot trickier in that my understanding of the science is that the number of hurricanes aren't projected to rise, it's the severity. But I think you need to make sure you're on solid science footing. This is myself speaking. I like to make sure I'm on solid science footing before I start making the attribution. So I will speak about the increased rain and increased flooding as something that we should be expecting, and as what, this is what we're trying to avoid in the future. But I'm always a little lenient on the Republican side to link to a number of hurricanes, or this is a bad hurricane season. The moisture in the air and the precipitation is something I will link to. But that's, yeah.
I was just going to agree. I think you have to be really careful and make sure that you're stating the facts right. Part of, I think, what makes CCL so great is our integrity, and we stick to facts, and especially in this political environment, it matters. The Union of Concerned Scientists has really great, clear, concise ways to talk about hurricanes and fires and what is actually attributable to climate change and what is not, and what are good phrases to use. So I recommend checking out their website, because I think it's really important to make sure that you use it factually.
So, "Nya, I told you so" doesn't cut it.
I wouldn't do that in either office, yeah. Which one? Oh, and Catherine Hayhoe also has information on how to talk about hurricanes. This is our last question. Then we get to go to lunch. Yay.
Hey. Hi, I'm Ed Fowler from San Diego. This question is toward Jim. In dealing with skeptical Republicans, would it be appropriate to kind of raise some fear that the other proposals out there to deal with climate change are less market-friendly than ours, and if you wait until the Democrats take over, which sooner or later, the tide is going to turn, you may get a lot less amenable solution than what we're proposing?
So I will say personally, I use that. If you're a Republican, I think a we discussion on that, of when speaking to another Republican, we could come up with some better things, is a good dialogue to be in. If you're a Democrat saying, we on the Democrat side are going to come up with some more devious things than you might come up with, I'm not sure I'd play it if you're not self-identifying as a conservative in the meeting. But yeah, I mean, I think I personally, as a conservative, I like having a dialogue with people of saying, God, who does this really well is Greg Mankiw, I think, of saying there are so many different ways we emit CO2. If we're going to wait for people to develop a regulatory scheme around every way we emit CO2, it's going to be a mess, and there's going to be secondary consequences to each one of them, as opposed to just putting a price in the system early and letting people creatively respond to that price. I think those dialogues can be healthy, but I'd be a little skeptical of trying to pull it off if you weren't convincing them that you're in their camp philosophically.
Thanks.
Back at 1:30. Enjoy your lunch, and see you at 1:30.